Tene koto, tene koto, tene koto, koto. Thank you. Kia ora and thanks. Hi, my name is Christian Stearns. Thank you for the introduction. I do have to say thanks again to the Ian Axford Fellowship in Fulbright, New Zealand for paying my way over here, which has been very nice. I've been here since January and I'll be here till the end of August. And my purpose is researching sustainable social housing. So just so you know, this is my contact information if you care. And some people ask, so why did you come to New Zealand to study sustainable social housing? And I said, well, if you read, and as we learned today, New Zealand is probably the world leader and first in legislation in creating state housing, 1905. They're also the first to create legislation to incorporate sustainability. So if you think about it, it sounds like a perfect place to study sustainable social housing, right? Well, I will say, I was a little disappointed when I came here, and I've been met many of you already, and asked, so give me one good example of sustainable social housing development out there. And I really never got an answer to that question. So as me and Philippa have been talking, and you know, if I had to give any recommendation in my brief 20-some years of housing and community development work of what could happen in New Zealand, it would be like one or two good examples of sustainable social housing. And that's really why we're here, I think, today. There's been a lot of research, as I told Philippa, there's research on every aspect and re-research of these issues, but the action piece is somehow eluded to a point. So I think you're in a perfect position right now. There's some things coming together right now where New Zealand really could be the model, develop a few models that would serve the rest of the developed world and what sustainable social housing really looks like. So that's my goal, that's my hope. I'm a little bit different working in the federal government. We have much more of an advocacy role, which I found is very different too. I mean, I spend half of my time going out talking to community groups, local governments. That's what I do. So once the policy is there, it's our job also to go out and promote it. So that's my job right today, is trying to promote some of these ideas. Most of everything that I got in my slides has already been talked about, so I'm going to run through them quickly and then hopefully have time for some questions and answers so that you can ask me anything about the U.S. that you ever wanted to know. Obviously, we haven't solved this issue ourselves, so I say that right up front. One of my other additional duties, though, was I was actually the regional sustainability officer for the Southeast U.S. So I got to travel around the Southeast, and we're working on what's called the Sustainable Communities Partnership model. I personally promote this action model concept, which is very basic: think, plan, act, measure. So I ask you to kind of keep this in your mind as you go through today. We've been doing a lot of thinking about what social housing looks like. I equate this to, there's a bumper sticker in the US, and I'm sure it's probably been here too. So it used to say, think globally, act locally. And from a systems point, what that means to me is when we're thinking about these issues, we really need to start looking at not only the impact on ourselves and our surrounding environment, on what we're doing, for example, building social housing, but that impact, what it means globally from a system-wide perspective. Similarly, we say plan regionally there, and that doesn't, people ask, what is that definition of region? What that means is you can no longer plan, individually. Wellington cannot make a plan on social housing just about Wellington. It needs to look outside its environment and the places and people that it touches and incorporate that into the plan. Act locally, you can only act within what you have control over. And if you try to go beyond that, sometimes where you get stymied because you're trying to control things that you have no control, and that leads to inaction. And finally, measure, I say from a government perspective, it's measure equity. Really, what are we all about in government is providing equal opportunity for people, social housing, out in the community. But it also means focusing on outcomes, being outcomes focused. So that's my little mantra that I tell everybody. Hopefully that will help you think. And now I thought a lot of my slides are on sustainability because that's my bent, but there's all 100% agreement. We could have just asked that question in the beginning of the session and probably got by with even having any more discussions about it. But I want you to really think about what that means. This is a model that was developed here in New Zealand, and for us in the States and most places internationally, they go by what we call the triple bottom line, which is environment, economy, and social. And we don't really talk about the cultural. And I think that's a very unique part that New Zealand really needs to grab a hold of, capture, and not just talk about as an issue, because now I see it mostly as, well, Maori housing issues, Pacifica housing issues, but as a strength to build on. Look at some of the great indigenous knowledge out there and what it tells us about sustainability, how to design a community, how to build a house, and build on that strength. Don't just treat it like an issue. You can see in the center, which I also think is good, is the goal is not sustainability. That's not the goal of being sustainable. It's well-being, and it's a balance of all those well-beings. So think about that a little bit as you go forward in your workshops. How do we balance environmental outcomes, social outcomes, economic outcomes, cultural outcomes? There's trade-offs there. Right now, the focus, as we all know, because of the global economic crisis, is on the economy side of it. But that alone will not solve the social housing issue. If we made housing affordable to everybody, we would still have housing issues because all the other outcomes would not be addressed. So think about that. Another unique thing I think about New Zealand sustainability that I found is there's this concept of strong versus weak sustainability. And in New Zealand, they said basically, you cannot just maintain what we have and have it sustainable for generations to come. We actually have to start restoring and regenerating those outcomes. Specifically the environment. We can't just maintain the environment where we're at. We need to restore and regenerate it. But think about in all those outcomes. Culturally, we can't just maintain where we're at. We need to restore and regenerate with what we build, with what we do. Something to think about, and something I think that's unique about New Zealand's model. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about America, my experience with the Sustainable Communities Partnership, which was a cross-government partnership, started off with the Department of Transportation and the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what we said is, how can we take these three government agencies who have some overlaps in the outcomes that they're looking to achieve and tie them together? So now we actually do cross-funded programs. The number one issue, and these are 6 livability principles that we came up, that we talk about across the government. The number one issue is provide more transportation choices. And people will think, that's kind of strange because we're talking about housing, right? Well, in the US, and it's maybe a little dissimilar here, but also true, in the US, we have people that pay up to 80% of their income on housing and transportation. So if you really want to think again about the well-being or the overall affordability of something, if we can take those two issues, put them together, and figure out how we can lower people's amount of income that's spent on them, that gives them expendable income to spend on the rest of their well-being. So similarly, I think in New Zealand, maybe not in Wellington, love the walkability of Wellington. I don't have a car, so it saves me quite a bit of money, which I'm glad to spend on my other parts of my well-being, which I won't talk about that. But so providing more transportation choices. So when you're developing, and today when you're thinking about it, how are you linking what you're doing in the housing world with transportation choices? And that doesn't always mean a light rail or whatever. It just means how are we consciously thinking about how to connect those two? And there's also, I think, you want to think about other things when we're talking on the funding side. How do we look at that as an outcome? So, for example, there's been discussion about transportation credit mortgages. So you give people, allow them to borrow more or give them better credit terms if they have a house where they don't have to have a car. Because the reality is, they have more expendable income to spend on their mortgage, and it has been proven through research that they actually have less default rates because obviously they don't have to worry about spending money on a car and transportation. So I'm not saying that, there's a lot of criticisms about that program in particular, but what I'm talking about is how do we link these together and start thinking about taking advantage of the funding and the resources that are available from these other outcomes and linking them together, because that's really the true key viability of the sustainability model, is how we use those to leverage. Promote equitable, affordable housing, of course. Equity, again, is large from our perspective because it means equal access to jobs, education, health, all those types of things, which again benefit the entire community and the entire society. The economics, of course, are always important, and affordability, as was discussed by Rafe and others, is certainly a key issue that we'll have to get to. But how again can you combine those issues together to capture the benefits of one and transfer them to the other? Enhancing economic competitiveness. Well, again, when we look at building social housing, we're not just looking at building that development itself, but what can we do to enhance the economics of that entire community? Access to jobs. When you're building the social housing development, are you hiring people from that neighborhood or from those developments? Are you giving them opportunities to do that? Are you leaving the neighborhood better off so that it can sustain itself economically? All those kind of things you're trying to capture in just a social housing development. Support existing communities. Sprawl, whether, and the Productivity Commission, I think, makes some interesting statements about urban land limits and some others that I won't talk about, but and I think New Zealand is unique in some ways about this discussion about whether it's cheaper to build in green fields or brownfields or gray fields. And from the U.S. perspective, we basically just said, our first option is infill. Our first option is to build gray field or brown field if we can. And it's to support those existing communities. Right now, I think most people will agree, although there's this myth about the house on a section, that we have to have some higher density housing if we want to reach the affordability issue. And it can be designed to be acceptable and sustainable for everybody. There's two groups of people in the U.S. we're finding, the younger generation and the older generation now, who their housing preference is actually moving more towards a medium density model. They don't want the lawn and the garden, and so again, as Philippa talked about, we're not just building houses for tomorrow, we're building houses for 20, 30, 40 years in the future. What are those going to look like? There might be a cultural bias to the house in a section right now, but will that be a reality in 30 or 40 years from now? Mixed income is also part of that. And I know there's lots of discussion about that, but certainly in the U.S. and all of our housing developments now, public housing developments, are all mixed-use developments now. This is a lot what I talked about. How do we coordinate policies and leverage investments? For example, in transportation and in the environment. If the city of Auckland is doing a project, redoing a street, how can we incorporate that into a social housing development that's occurring? Or the private sector is doing some development on some kind of commercial project. How do we take advantage of that, leverage that, and build social housing or take advantage of the opportunities from that in social housing? How do we coordinate those policies so that we're not double spending money? In the U.S., we spend a lot of money. One organization or federal agency will come in and do a project, and then another agency comes in and rips out half of that project and then redoes the other half because they haven't coordinated that. A lot of wasted resources. And that's not just within government, that goes across public, private sectors, community sectors, and public sectors. So thinking about how to leverage the investment that we're already putting into a community. And finally, of course, valuing communities and neighborhoods. Certainly from a cultural standpoint, but building, and I like to say I work from what's called the asset-based community development model, which means we try to build on the strengths of those communities. Rather than trying to resolve issues, we look at the community, what are your strengths, and how do we build on those strengths. So when we do a social housing development, and now, for example, we have a program which has been an evolution of our public housing redevelopments called Choice Neighborhoods, where before the social housing development can actually occur, the whole community has to come together, create a neighborhood plan, and talk about how that social housing development fits into the whole neighborhood, fits into the economy of that neighborhood, fits into the education system, the health system. The private sector is tied to it. So it's much more about how we use that opportunity of that social housing development to uplift the whole neighborhood and the whole community, to build on their strengths. So that's my thinking piece, and so hopefully that'll give you a little bit to think about. Again, I know, and I'll be glad to talk about U.S. models if you want. The next piece is the planning piece, and this is another thing that I found very interesting. There was a housing strategy done in 2005. If you read it, it's very interesting, the things it says that it will do and the updates that it will have. And I know sometimes, strategic plans don't always get used, but I think it's nice to know what your strategy is and what your vision is. And I think that's maybe a little bit of an issue right now. I don't think there really is a strategy right now. We know that the economy is driving a lot of things, and there's some economic factors for what we're doing, but where we're trying to get to, again, it's not really laid out, and I don't think there's any agreement on that. One interesting place I found, though, social housing, was in the National Infrastructure Plan. And I thought this was again, from an economic perspective and from maybe a treasury and economist perspective, as you may know, social housing is the Crown's second largest asset at $15.1 billion. That is a huge asset, and there's equity and a lot of, I think, ways that you could look at that, of how we take advantage of that. But I would redirect you to look at their number one asset, which is what? State highways. How do they plan for state highways? How is that planned for? How do they fund state highways? I think it's an interesting perspective, and I don't want to say it's the answer, but I think it's a direction that New Zealand went off kind of uniquely to even put it in that plan. So maybe go with it for a little bit, think about it. They've actually created a national social infrastructure fund, if you haven't heard about it, a private equity fund that is designed to help pay for social infrastructure. Right now, they're using it, to do schools and prisons and things like that, but social housing is actually listed in that plan as part of the social infrastructure. So it's another way maybe of thinking about it, of looking at it. The planning part, how do we plan for highways? Whose responsibility is infrastructure? What's the local government's role? What's the private sector's role? What's the nonprofit role? So the big change right now, I think, and I work in the Department of Building and Housing, but I don't represent the Department of Building and Housing. So whatever I say, Chris Worth is right there, he can correct me. But I'm not going to talk a lot about other than to say, if you haven't heard, all social housing policy has shifted from Housing New Zealand over to the Department of Building and Housing. So it's their job now, not only to set policy for all housing policy, that means affordable, social, private. So they're really, it's their charge right now to create that plan. So they're doing a lot of work on it right now, but they are doing a lot of focus groups and sessions. Robert's been doing sessions with the SHU to get input from the community. So I think they really are looking for that input. So now is the time, I think, to start providing that input. Robert talked already about the social housing unit, and I just want to reiterate kind of what their mission and goals are. He talked about it, but just to give you an idea. They're the operational and practical focus. They want to deliver growth in the supply of social and affordable housing through non-governmental providers. And non-governmental was, I think, kind of a key word too, because it started off as third sector and grew into non-governmental, which to me indicates there's a lot more openness to the private sector piece, which we're very glad that there's a lot of private sector representation here, because I think that was one piece that, at least in the one focus group that I went to with the SHU, there wasn't really as much representation there. So now's the time to get your views across. And the last was promote innovation, diversity, and scale in the social housing sector. Innovation. So think about that today when you're going through your plans. The Social Housing Investment Plan is the plan that the Department of Building and Housing is putting together along with the social housing unit. And that's like the long-term plan of how social housing strategy, from the supply side anyway, is going to be looked at. So again, all those things are happening right now. Now's a great time to talk to your government in any way that you can, to the representatives here and through emailing, I guess. Just going back to that concept of social housing as infrastructure. I pulled this quote out of Cedric First's book, State Housing, back in 1949, just because I thought it was interesting. And this was actually what is listed in the Housing Shareholders Advisory Group report, the golden age of social housing, about the 50s to the 70s, meaning from a supply side anyway, the most production. And this is what they said about it. So think about that. The other promising things I think about, if you think about social housing as part of the social housing community or sustainable community structure, is we get away from these arguments about, is it deserved, is it needed? It's just like roads, just like water. Social housing is a part of building a community. Basically, from the time that property rights were put forward, there's been some kind of social housing. Today you're going to talk about planning, and so there's planning of the building itself on the top. There's the actual site plan, which is going to be your focus, but I'm asking you to remember that includes the buildings themselves in your thought, and also how that fits into the community, back in the bottom right corner. So today, when you go out to your breakout groups, you're going to focus on a site, but again, from a systems perspective, remember that you want to keep in mind both the buildings that you're building on that site and where the site is in the community. Again, a quote, I think we've decided this on partnerships. I'll put this in here because to me, from what I've read and what I've seen, the focus on partnerships and the way that it's defined in New Zealand right now is really that top definition. And I think that's what hinders some of the action, because people forget the second definition, which is it's really bringing people together for a shared and common goal. And that's the part I think that will move this ahead. Who should care? There's also this concept of competition versus cooperation that I see. And I think building purpose-built partnerships where it's more cooperative, because in some ways the competition model might not be 100% effective right now. And involving everybody, including down to the community and the citizens. Now I'm going to have to speed through. This is the PPP model again. So this is like a logic model that kind of shows you from inputs out to outcomes. Again, just reminding you to be focused on the outcome piece, but also making sure that your partnerships are put together based on those outcomes and not just on the legal structure of a public and private partnership. It includes the community sector, includes the community. So we've talked about this, and what does a outcomes-focused social housing look like? So think about it from the sustainability perspective. And the last part is we keep talking about how we capture all these benefits that are, and I think this is the whole key to the thing. If we start thinking about the co-benefits from social housing, how do we start capturing the values in those? So when Philpa and their group does a study on the warm-up Housing New Zealand, shows a 2-to-1 payoff in health-related benefits, yet we choose to fund more on giving more to the health department to put people in hospitals rather than giving more money to keep people out of hospitals. We need to start looking at those broader issues and how we can start taking the value from one outcome and putting it into the whole sustainable social housing project. All the different benefits to the economy. That means not just as individuals, but also as the community as a whole. The environment again, saving energy, saving greenhouse gas emissions. How do we value that? Social and cultural outcomes. How do we value that? So, our workshop, and you know, if I'm using that infrastructure model, I would say what New Zealand needs is a couple housing projects of national significance. People to sit down and say, we're going to do this as a model of what we can do in New Zealand, what works for New Zealand. We're going to measure it so we can follow along what's working, what doesn't work, so that we're not talking about what works in the UK or what works in the US, and then saying, well, that's never going to work in New Zealand because of this and because of that. You do it, and you learn from what you've done, and build a model on that works for New Zealand. Are you going to talk about the workshop piece?
I think we give you a check.
Okay. Thank you.